Having finished building the bandsaw, I took it all apart to paint the individual pieces, and I took the frame and some of the other pieces out to my shop in the country where I could varnish it without the smell getting into the house, plus I could dry it by the wood stove. And then I could finally haul the frame back into the basement and put it back together. I still haven't built a stand for it, so I'm just using these two plywood boxes for the time being. And then I remembered I really need to attach two pieces of wood to the bottom just to make the bandsaw less tippy when it's not attached to a stand. So while you're watching me assemble this saw, let me answer some questions that have been asked a lot. First question is, why did I build this bandsaw? Well, I last built a bandsaw back in 2011, and the video quality that I made for that wasn't all that good, so I thought I should really make some more up-to-date video on building a bandsaw, and if I'm going to build another one, I might as well build something that's a little bit bigger. And then there's the question, why didn't I make it even bigger? Well, I wanted to make it so it would work with a 132-inch blade, which is a relatively standard length. And also, I have a limited ceiling height in my workshop, so I figured that was a reasonable size. In retrospect, I could have gone a tiny bit bigger with a slightly longer blade, but what's done is done. I'm often asked, how much does it cost to build a bandsaw? Well, that's a tough one. My answer's usually been between $50 and $600. It's such a wide range because it really depends on how much junk you've already got. If you have to buy all the material new, then you're not really saving a lot of money by building your own bandsaw. But if you've already got a lot of pile of junk that might be suitable, then it can be very cheap. I think I might have spent maybe $150 on that. I had to buy the electrical stuff. I had to buy about $30 worth of 6mm plywood, and I used up about $10 worth of 18mm Baltic birch. All the softwood for the frame came from the garbage, and all the hardwood that's part of this bandsaw came from firewood or from other bits of lumber that I milled myself, so no money spent on that. I had to buy the shaft and bearing new, and that was probably about $60, that's all Canadian, and I also had to buy some bandsaw blades. And the bandsaw blades were probably the most expensive part of this saw. Now another question I keep getting is, how long does it take to build this saw? Well, that can vary dramatically from person to person. When I was building this saw, I wasn't building it straight through because I was also shooting video of it and taking breaks to edit the video, and I was also still tweaking some of the design. But I think if I was building it again and I was building it straight through, I would take about 1 day for the wheels, 2 days for the frame. That would have taken less if I used new material. 1 day for the wheel mounts, 1 day for the blade guards, 1 day for a table and trunnions, 1 day for the enclosure, and 1 day to paint it, for a total of about 8 days. And here's some more popular questions. Most popular is, can I use plywood for the frame? The problem with plywood is half the grain goes this way, half the grain goes that way. The cross grain has got almost no stiffness, which means you've only got half the grain actually working for you, which means your frame will be less stiff out of plywood and it'll also cost more. Why did I angle the guide blocks like this? Well, main reason is with the screws on either side and angling them like that, I can make the guide blocks come down to the bottom edge of this thing here. But also, I find if I'm cutting wood, when I'm cutting tenons and cutting out of the grain like this, it's much harder to cut than if I'm cutting like this into the grain. So I imagine I'll get much more life out of my guide blocks if it's going like this, out of the grain like this, as opposed to, for instance, something like this, or cross grain. Not that guide block life has been a problem in the past. For the bottom blade guides, to angle them up would be kind of counterintuitive because then you'd really be catching the grain. And to angle them down would channel debris in between the blade guides, and there's a lot of sawdust down here, so I figured the safest would be to just put them horizontal. Why didn't I use metal threaded inserts for the screws in here? Well, the thing is I'm very close to the edge here, so if I'd used metal inserts, I would have had to make this block a lot bigger and then it would come down further. And I haven't had a problem with these so far. If there is a problem, well, I can always replace this whole block. But one of my bandsaws already uses screws straight into the wood, and I made that 5 years ago and I haven't had a problem. Why does the top thrust bearing run against the blade like this instead of like this? Well, I found this way it runs a lot quieter, which is why most commercial bandsaws actually have it like that. Which is also why I'm using guide blocks instead of bearings like this, because when I experimented with bearings like this many years ago, it was just really loud. Now below the table I have the thrust bearing in this orientation, and the reason for that is I always set it so the bandsaw blade barely doesn't touch this bearing when it's idling, and then once it's cutting it pushes against here, at which point this bearing turns, but it doesn't matter because the bandsaw makes a whole lot of noise while it's cutting, so I can't hear this bearing. Why not make it so it can also tilt left? Well, if I did that, I'd have to have the table a lot further up so that I don't hit the wheel because it's already very close here. And I'd also have to have less bearing surface on the trunnion to get more tilt angle. So without the left tilt, I get more resaw height, which is really important, and the trunnions are simpler and stronger. How big a motor do you need for a bandsaw? I've used a saw quite a lot with just a 1/3 horsepower motor on it, and for ordinary bandsaw use that was actually plenty of power, and with this 3/4 horsepower motor I was able to mill through a big log, so you really don't need that much power. I do have a 2 horsepower motor that maybe I'll put on there eventually when I start playing around with actually using it to do some sawmilling, but for now the 3/4 horsepower motor is more than enough. Now there was a few things that I kind of messed up in the construction of this bandsaw. Let me show you. I needed to put some blocks in here for the springs. I should have just made these parts a little bit longer. I fixed that in the plans. I have absolutely no clearance for the enclosure underneath the table because the wheel comes very close to the table. That's another thing I fixed in the plans. I screwed up doweling these trunnions onto the beam here, which is why there's a slight gap here. Not that it matters much. The front one is the one that takes more load, and that one doesn't really have a gap. The inserts that I made for the bolts here out of coupler nuts, that was very inelegant because I didn't drill the holes quite straight. I should have been more careful with that. And it's also why I recommend not going this way, but just using big wood screws to attach this trunnion beam. I also put the trunnion beam in the wrong place because when I made it, I marked right here what goes to the back edge of the frame, except then I added this extra piece here to give me more support, and then when I lined it up to drill the holes, I lined up my mark to this extra piece of wood, which means this whole beam is about 1 centimeter further back than it should be in the design. Fortunately, I had enough clearance and tolerance with the blade guides that it was okay, and then I just mounted the trunnions on the bottom of the table so that the hole for the blade still lined up with the right spot. So that's my big 20-inch bandsaw. It was a lot of work to build, but for my basement workshop, it's really the only option because I can't even imagine how I'd get just an 18-inch bandsaw down the stairs and around the corner, whereas this thing, I can carry the pieces all by myself.